Hi guys, hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm struggling a bit with the technology today, but fingers crossed it will all go okay. I promised some time to answer some questions that I'd had relating to some of the videos that I'd done previously, and so I thought I'd get on with some of those, as well as hopefully providing an update. The update might have to be in a separate video. But first of all, one of the questions I received was about what the first day like on inpatient is like, and I can only share my experience. I'm sure it differs for different people based on where they are and who they are and how ill they are, and whether they've come from home directly or whether they've come from general hospital. I'd come from a bit of both. I'd been in general hospital for just under a week, but had wanted a day at home to break it up and to be able to pack. And I was medically safe just about to do that, although I wouldn't endorse it if you're not medically safe. So the first day is chaos. Everybody wants a piece of you, or at least that was the case in my admission. They usually want you to get there before a specific time so it doesn't interrupt patient meal times. So bear that in mind if you have to travel a long way. They will want the medical team to see you and to check you over, make sure that there's nothing that means that you need to be transferred instantly back to hospital. They'll do an ECG, they'll do lots of blood tests, they will check things like your potassium and your sodium, which you'll be used to having checked in the community if you've been under a community team, or in hospital if you've been in hospital. They'll take a history from you, so they'll take a medical history, they'll ask about any other medical conditions, but then they'll also take a mental health history where they'll ask about any other psychiatric conditions. So common things that we see co-occurring with anorexia: depression, which can just be really hard to differentiate from the anorexia itself. Anorexia can make you very slowed down, reduces your cognition, affects your sleep, makes you very monotone, lowers your mood, whereas once that nutrition is restored, those things can pick up. So it can be really quite challenging for a psychiatrist to tease those apart and tease apart what is depression of an eating disorder and what is a separate depression on top. Other common occurring mental illnesses include anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorders, very common, which you can probably understand because we obsess a lot around food. Emotionally unstable personality disorder, although that isn't backed up by a huge amount of research, and the research that there is, it tends to link more to bulimia nervosa than anorexia nervosa, and also autism. And as I've previously mentioned, around 30% of people with anorexia nervosa are suspected of having underlying either diagnosed or undiagnosed autism, and that information can be found on the Peace Pathway, who have done their research into this. And that was certainly the case with me, and I was fortunate on this admission to already have that diagnosis. I'm not sure I would have got it on this admission alone, as it's still quite a new thing for a lot of psychiatrists. I think they screen for it quite readily down south. They don't necessarily up north. However, I had a very on the ball clinician in the community, specialist nurse in eating disorders, and he referred me onwards for assessment, including a very lengthy developmental assessment, and that diagnosis was confirmed when I was 30, so about a year ago now. Other things that happen on the day, you will have to fit in eating, and that will come as a shock, because if you haven't been, or if you've been on an NG, that can hit you hard. Different places have different meal plans, often typically 3 meals and 3 snacks a day, which increase in size as you go through the eating disorder program. And that doesn't mean to say that everybody reaches the same size or the same portions, because of course we're all different heights, we all have different metabolic rates, and different needs, different requirements. Some of us might be recovering from other illnesses, infections, and therefore our dietary requirements might be more, for example. So you'll also meet with the dietitian to discuss that. It might be that where there are places where you can be NG fed, that might be the option that you still feel most comfortable with. Certainly that's an option on this ward, and there are plenty that opt for that, or co-opt for that perhaps with the rest of the MDT, if it's found that they are not making adequate progress with the oral diet alone, and that can sometimes be a mixed choice as well, so some NG and some oral. So far, touch wood, as was my promise to myself when I came in, I have avoided the NG. I absolutely hate it for sensory reasons and for traumatic reasons from my experiences in general hospital. I don't want to put other people off for other people. It can be a literal lifesaver. It is extremely important in certain circumstances. It's just, for me, if I'm well enough to make a decision, then it's not something I would immediately opt for. Having said that, oral diet has not been easy, especially with post-COVID symptoms, where my taste has been affected, where I've continued to have persistent nausea, persistent vomiting, ongoing chest infections, as you'll have seen from previous videos. Though I am feeling slightly better, which is a positive, and doing slightly better in terms of progress. So I need to take those positives, and I am doing, and it's reflected in what I'm getting back, in the responsibility I'm getting, in the leave, the freedoms that I'm getting, the time that I'm now being able to spend with family. So what else on day one? Those are some of the most significant things. You'll get to meet most of the staff. There'll be so many staff that come and introduce themselves, you will not remember their names. You'll barely have chance to unpack. Be aware that many places do supervise you unpacking, and that's because they want to check that you haven't brought in any contraband, like for example any sharps, razors and manicure sets, things like that often get temporarily taken off you and then you request them when you need them. Or anything, for example, laxatives or anything that wouldn't be allowed. They usually give you a list of things that they don't allow prior to the admission. You'll see a pharmacist who'll go through all your current medications and make any recommendations as to what should be on your drug chart. You'll see your key nurse at some point. And then the multidisciplinary team, which is all the members of the team, the doctors, the nurses, the dietitians, the OTs, the psychologists. I've probably missed a load of people out, but they come together and they make a decision about your care and decide what is safest for you. So it might be that initially what is safest for you is bed rest and being on an NG. It might be that what is safest for you is being on the lowest meal plan and only mobilising with a wheelchair, as was the case when I was admitted. But that does get reviewed and that does get changed at every MDT, so don't lose hope. There's an MDT usually weekly. You can also speak to your key nurse when they're in, or they've usually got sort of a reserve key nurse that you can speak to. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else to cover on that first day. It's just, I can just remember being so exhausted and completely overwhelmed, sort of almost in an autistic meltdown from just the number of knocks on the door, all the different OBS, having an ECG done, all the different assessments, all the different questions, all the forms I had to fill in. Do try and fill in the About Me forms, because that's where they can get a chance to understand what your triggers are, what distresses you and what helps you, whether you're autistic or not. And the quicker they understand that, the quicker they can help you. MDTs are also another time where you can discuss things like visits and family coming to visit you, you going to visit family. If you're like me, that might be a big topic of conversation and something that's much harder to arrange because you don't have family locally. And so for me that often takes up a lot of my MDT discussions. COVID wise, I think different wards are operating different rules. So at the moment on this ward, you tend to spend 5 days in isolation, and then once you have a negative PCR, you are allowed to mix with the rest of the ward. And I think a lot of places have a similar sort of setup, but it's worth checking with the ward that you're going to. Most also allow visitors, but not on the ward, so somewhere off the ward, like the hospital cafe, for example, and that's the case here. So again, it's worth checking that out before you go. Usually there's a point of contact where you can ask questions before you go to make sure that you aren't bringing anything you shouldn't, or to make sure that you've got those things like visiting really well and truly sorted. I hope that's been helpful. I realise that's been quite a long answer, but it's quite complex, and as I say, does vary depending on where you are, so don't take my word for it. This is for one unit in the UK, and there are several units in the UK and all operate different rules and standards. But I hope that helps.